I invoke you, demons, many men buried together, and dead by violence, and dead before your time, and deprived of burial. You who lie here below, dead before your time, and nameless. It is a harrowing appeal to the dead. This curse, one among hundreds, was found in Amathus, Cyprus, carefully deposited in a mass grave. We can infer from the wording of this particular tablet that the grave held the remains of dozens who met a violent end. The tablet, however, is anything but atypical. Hundreds of curse tablets, prophylactic amulets, and clay poppets used for malevolent aims have been unearthed across the Mediterranean, with 200 of these having been unearthed in Amathus alone. A sizable amount for such a small city on the fringes of the Hellenistic and Roman world. According to Pliny the Elder, however, Cyprus was known for its magic. In fact, the discovery of the Amathusian tablets suggests not only the practice of magic, but amazingly, the existence of a professional class of magicians who were regularly solicited for their services. With me today to discuss magic in ancient Cyprus is Professor Drew Wilburn from Oberlin College. Drew's research focuses on the archaeology of ancient magic in the Roman Mediterranean and village life in Greco-Roman Egypt. Drew's book, Magica Materia, The Archaeology of Magic in Egypt, Spain, and Cyprus, explores magic in the objects of daily life from antiquity. He suggests that individuals frequently turn to magic in their daily lives, particularly in times of crisis. Most recently, he had been studying the role that magic plays in architecture, investigating the placement of protective features in houses and other buildings. Drew, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks so much, Andreas. It's really great to be here and having a chance to talk with you today.
My pleasure. So I just want to start off asking you what sort of drew you to this particular focus with magic in antiquity.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, that goes back to my days as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and I was kind of interested not so much in magic, but in just archaeological finds in general. And there's a amazing museum at the University of Michigan, the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, and that holds thousands of artifacts, many from excavations that Michigan took part in and that they received as part of their concession in Egypt. And anyway, I went upstairs one day with the then registrar, Robin Meadow Woodruff, and asked, do you have anything that might be interesting to look at? And Robin said, well, I've got this drawer of bones that are all painted with red, like designs, and we don't really know what they're doing. So Robin showed me this drawer, and they were these amazing artifacts from Karanis in Egypt, and I kind of set to work investigating them and determined that they were probably the result of a magical rite that had been conducted at Karanis, likely to help livestock. And I thought this is just fantastic, right? To kind of get in touch with the artifacts that people used in their daily lives to have an effect on the world. And that really set me off to look at magic in general, to sort of understand, again, a little bit more the daily lives of ancient individuals and their struggles and their challenges, and to kind of find voices that we don't often get to hear in antiquity.
And how did you end up in Cyprus? What was its appeal?
Cyprus was a logical next stepping stone, next place to look. As I think you know, Cyprus is really a crossroads of the Mediterranean, connected so closely with both east and west, north and south. It's a critical space for travel, transport, and the exchange of ideas. So for me, I thought Cyprus would be a really logical place to try and look for ritual practices that I hoped at the time that kind of embodied that transmission of knowledge, that exchange for which Cyprus is so well known. So that was sort of how I ended up working on Cyprus and looking for magical material on the island, and that led me necessarily to this giant cache of curse tablets from Amathus.
Right, and I suppose a colleague of yours, not a direct colleague, Daniel Ogden,
Mhm.
has written a book called Magic, Witchcraft, and Ghosts, and he does say that Greek rituals akin to binding magic certainly existed in their own right, but we cannot discount the certain Near Eastern and Egyptian rites that were in a strong position to exercise influence over it. Is this why Amathus is at its center? And the reason why I ask that is, I mean, if we consider where it's located, its proximity to Egypt, its vibrant port, it's a bustling port city, and it has a peculiar syncretic blend of Greek, Phoenician, and indigenous elements. We also know that there's a significant Cypriot corpus, suggesting an indigenous populace as well. I mean, is this really the perfect crucible for this exchange of cultures and ideas and potentially magic?
I think it is a perfect crucible, but I think that the magic that we're seeing at Amethyst, which is third century CE, is a later iteration of that. So we don't really have the earliest examples of curse tablets from Cyprus. They're actually coming out of Athens and Selinus on the island of Sicily, but and that tradition, which starts in the late sixth and early fifth century, then makes its way throughout the Mediterranean, and indeed, it's probably connected again to uh, back to Phoenicia, back to the Levant, to Egypt. I think we have trouble so often picking apart the multitude of crisscrossing exchanges that are going on at any point in antiquity, um, where the Mediterranean was truly a melting pot of lots of different traditions through various processes of exchange.
Do you know anything about its religious orientation at the time? From what I've read, it's very much, I mean, it's not, we couldn't quite call it a Greek city, although Aphrodite was certainly worshipped there. I know there's evidence of Hathor, Isis, Serapis, so many different gods and goddesses there. Are you able to speak to that?
Yes, I mean I certainly can. I mean I think we certainly see a very strong Egyptian tradition also there, as you've already mentioned. There's a probably a sanctuary to Bes. There's a large statue of Bes now in the Istanbul Museum, which is likely from Amathus. So we definitely have an intense amount of interaction between Cyprus and the Near East and Egypt. Really starting, to my mind, in the sixth century, we see it in tombs, sixth century BCE. So by the time we get to the third century CE, I think we've had lots of contacts. The Hellenistic period brings the Ptolemies to the island, and a reiteration or reinvigoration of Egyptian contacts, and again that's continuing through the early first century religiously. Of course, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about Paul's journey to the island. So we're getting the influx of Christianity again from the east. So by the time we get to the period in which these curse tablets are deposited, the third century or so, we've had centuries of uh, intermingling religious practices. You mentioned, of course, the Temple of Aphrodite, but we also have these other temples to Hathor, to Bes, that are all kind of functioning at the same time in the city of Amathus.
Has your work ever brought you into contact with any curse tablets or magical markings that predate the Roman period?
I think we do have some texts in the Cypriot syllabary that we don't necessarily know much about. Um, I think more than anything, I think probably the one of the options that you suggested that we just haven't necessarily found it. It doesn't mean it's not there, but I think probably there are magical traditions, ritual traditions that are existing on Cyprus before the Roman period. One of the difficulties, which I'm sure you know from archaeological study in general, is sometimes it's just hard to identify these things in the archaeological record um, in terms of knowing what you're looking at. if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
So the curse tablets we can identify because they're inscribed and we can read the text quite well, not quite easily, but we can read the text. But for some other artifacts, it's very difficult without textual references to definitively say that a certain object had a magical function in antiquity.
So I'm going to circle back and start from the beginning, which is try to wrap my head around what distinguishes magic from, let's say, religion. And we know, for example, that people solicited oracles for their services, but I'm not sure that we would necessarily classify that within magic. So, how do we avoid conflating the two?
Well, I think that's a very complicated problem, Andreas, in many ways. I should say, too, that at Oberlin College, we have a great series of lectures each year called the Martin Classical Lectures, where we bring in a major scholar to speak. And this year's lecturer was Esther Eidenau from the University of Bristol, who came and spoke about the idea of magical thinking. And her lectures were very interesting. She certainly made me think about a lot of how we kind of categorize magic and how we conceptualize magic. So I wanted to sort of mention that she came and helped me as I'm thinking about these things as well. The real problem that we run into is that I think there's not an easy dividing line between magic and religion. Uh, so much of these topics is really dependent on where a person stands, right? In other words, those are internal conceptual ideas that individuals uh, sort of divide certain ritual acts into, well, that one's magic and that one's religion, right?
Mhm.
Um, and other people may have very different ideas of whether a particular ritual is magic or religious. Oftentimes, our concepts of magic depend on if something is viewed as normative, right, as acceptable, as legitimate. Magic often falls into that non-normative, non-acceptable, not legitimate category. Religion is a positive term. In that answer, I guess the other thing that we have to think about is so often religion and magic are closely interconnected. There's a significant amount of exchange between religious practices and magical practices, borrowings, if you will, between the two. Um, so if there are things that we can definitively refer to as magic, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's a rather roundabout answer I'm giving you.
No, no, it's. I think I'm understanding to a certain degree when you think of religion and, let's say, prayer, because I mean one of the it appears magic is generally a private exercise, and I know there's a class of practitioners that we're going to talk about, which might contradict exactly what I just said. But and I know, for example, that in Rome, infamously, there was anti-magic legislation.
Mhm.
Um, and so we know that this wasn't something that was celebrated, but it does seem that, at least in Cyprus, was this tacitly tolerated?
I think that's a really great question. You mentioned that in Rome, in the city of Rome, and in Roman law, we have laws against magic, preventing people from performing magic, usually harmful magic, but sometimes magic directed against the state. We assume that these laws are kind of similar or in effect in other places, but we don't really know. We also don't necessarily know whether things like the curses that we're going to be looking at would have been viewed as uh, illegal acts or not. We think they probably were, certainly in the center. But it's a complicated question, Andreas. I mean, I think you're so many of these issues are hard to kind of pin this is definitely the case, or this is definitely not the case. And it's rather a challenge, because there's so many moments when we're looking at a particular example of practice, um, it seems to break the barriers down,
Mhm.
that we're trying to establish. So going back to your question, if I can circle back to your question about whether these rights are prohibited in Cyprus or not, I think the answer is, sadly, we don't know. We have no legal documents from Cyprus that would suggest that they're illegal. What we do have in the tablets is one of the tablets, the lead tablets, curses the governor of Cyprus, Theodorus at the time. That's almost certainly illegal, right?
Yeah, yeah, I know which one you're talking about.
Right,
We'll talk about that one in a
right,
minute.
absolutely, absolutely. But whether the actual practice of using a curse is illegal or not is kind of an open question.
It really appears that when we talk about prayer, like magic, can be very private, but it seems that when someone prays, they're supplicating, they're appealing to. Is it fair to say when someone's practicing magic, they are attempting to manipulate and control? Is that a fair? Is that fair to say?
I think that has been one of the sort of markers or hallmarks that people have used to differentiate magic and religion. They
Mhm.
see magic as compulsive, and prayer as a request. Um, I think again, personally, there we end up in a question of what the viewer thinks. Right? It is a
Subjective.
it's thank you. It's a subjective idea, right? Because you can certainly ask a divinity nicely for something,
Mhm.
or perhaps you're a bit more forceful in your request. So it's again a subjective question, but I think that is a I find the question of private versus public a bit more useful. Whether the goal of an act is intended for a private or a very personal gain, or whether it's perhaps more collective. Again, all these categories, all these concepts run us into some trouble. There's a lot of gray areas in them.
Pliny the Elder, he actually refers to Cyprus in particular. He calls it a recent branch of magic that's practiced in Cyprus. And my Latin is awful. But and I'm gonna avoid ecclesiastical Latin here. I think I'm gonna try the classical Latin. Magicus factio, is that what he?
That's good.
It's close enough, right?
Absolutely good enough for our work today.
Yeah. So that word in particular really stood out, right? And I think it's really important. I think historians, archaeologists alike would use that to justify the presence of, rather, would it suggest a presence of practitioners, like a class of magicians in Cyprus.
hmm
So my question is, can you speak to Pliny the Elder's reference and how that has been interpreted?
So you're absolutely right to take a look at Pliny there. Um, Pliny's statement is pretty clear. He says that there's a branch of magic, or you said the Latin, a factio, a school, a kind of type of magic, perhaps. Again, we get into issues of translation of the Latin here. Um, it is a little unclear, even to me, still at this point, how distinct Pliny's factio for Cyprus, how distinct his specific magical school on Cyprus is from the school that he talks about, or the type that he talks about previously, which is that of the Jews. I've gone back and forth on this a lot, in fact, in my own thinking, because he mentions, I can just throw the whole quote at you, right? There's another branch of magic derived from Moses, Yanes, Lotapes, and the Jews, but living many thousands of years after Zoroaster. So much more recent is the branch in Cyprus, and that's basically, regrettably, all he says in that text. So it's a little unclear whether he's differentiating the Cypriot branch or whether he's locating the Jewish branch on Cyprus. Certainly, we have what we may think of as even now, right, a distinct kind of Jewish magic, which my colleague Gideon Bohack has written extensively about. Um, and that may be what he's talking about on Cyprus. What we can say without a doubt is that certainly Pliny is locating magic on the island of Cyprus. He's saying that Cyprus is an important space that he knows of for magical practice.
Now, you mentioned that in that full quote, it talks about Jewish magic. Does that go far to explain the reference of a magician in the Acts of the Apostles? So, for those listening, we know that Saint Paul travels through Cyprus, comes across the court of Proconsul Sergius Paulus, and I'm not sure how to interpret this. Is this a magician whose name is Elymas, also referred to as Bar Jesus? Does that go far in explaining why this magician just happens to be a Jewish magician in the court of Sergius Paulus?
I think it does a lot to help us understand that passage. It's a very intriguing passage, Andreas, and you're right to point it out. Um, Paul arrives on Cyprus. He travels around. He's preaching the word of Jesus, and he runs into this individual who's identified as a magician. And interestingly enough, he strikes that individual, Elymas or Bar Jesus, blind as part of the story, which I find to be really intriguing, and it gets us back at that question that you just asked about magic and religion, right?
Mhm.
What is Paul doing? He's able to have this, what one may think of as almost a malicious effect against,
Right.
right? That he's able to strike someone else blind, right? So what is Paul doing? Is Paul the magician in this context as well?
Right. Yeah.
He's of course practicing a miracle because he's working through the power of God. But he is diametrically opposed to this figure who's a magician, who is uh, doing various things. We're never really told why Bar Jesus is a magician or a sorcerer. Um, but it's a fascinating text, and I think you're right to sort of locate that tradition of magic again on Cyprus through this textual instance.
There have been a number of magical markings that have been excavated in Cyprus and outside of Amathus, including a very famous palindromic amulet. In other words, it's a magical amulet that is read the same way forwards as it is backwards. There was also a very infamous curse tablet excavated in, I want to say, Paphos, which has it's sort of a love spell that has a sensational inscription: "May your penis hurt when you make love." So a lot of interesting stuff happening in Cyprus. But what I found particularly interesting is that many of these finds, they date to the 6th and 7th century CE, where Christianity was already firmly rooted on the island. And so I find that very fascinating because you would think that with the Christianization of the island, one would expect these pagan rituals would have disappeared altogether. But these kind of demonstrate that this isn't so. I mean, we have references to other chthonic deities and Egyptian gods still, even at this time. Is this something you came across? And I don't know how you sort of were able to reconcile the two, the presence of Christianity and the persistence of this magic.
That is a great question, Andreas. But I think really the question we have to ask is not what tools are people using and whether we should classify them as Christian or let's say traditional, right? Uh,
Right.
but but what are they trying to do? Are they in crisis? And what are they attempting to solve using magic? I think we have to think about the fact that people in general use the tools at hand, and when we're running into things that may look, let's say, traditional. I don't like the term pagan myself because it implies that paganism, like Christianity, is a kind of a monolithic monolithic religion, and really paganism is just sort of local traditions, um, right? That predate Christianity, right? Again, uh, but in both of these instances that you're talking about, we have people who are dealing with problems, right? This palindromic amulet found at Paphos is a fascinating piece. We have this palindrome, right, which seems to perhaps have a Christian or Jewish reference, right? But also it has, right, it refers to Re, the sun god, and to the Jewish god, which could be Jewish or Christian at this point. And then on the reverse of the amulet, we have a number of figures shown. Osiris, probably, who's mummified, right?
Hmm.
A snaky figure, some other, perhaps an illustration of Harpocrates, who's the son of Osiris and Isis. So we have this wonderful object which has, again, a real conglomeration of ritual practices drawn, as we see again and again, right,
Hmm.
from the Near East, from the Levant, and from Egypt. Um, so it's if anything, it's fitting into the traditions that we see in Cyprus earlier, and what it's not fitting into is our conceptualization of what Christians should be doing at this time. And I think we have to give some credit to the Christians on Cyprus who maybe are just trying to use whatever methods they can to solve their problems. If whether that's kind of a pagan tradition or not, they seem to preserve some degree of belief in these traditions, and whatever practitioners might be there are drawing on those deep-rooted traditions as well as contemporary Christianity to solve their problems. It's a fascinating thing, and we see exactly the same thing going on in Egypt at this same time period in the fourth, fifth, and sixth centuries. We have many Coptic spells that are being written out, and Coptic, of course, is the sort of it's a later script of Egyptian that's using Greek characters or Greek letter forms, and it's the typical language of the Coptic Church, the Coptic Christian Church. Um, and these many of these texts, which include both instructional texts, that is, spell books for doing magic, as well as sort of the remains of rituals. Many of them combine what we would certainly identify as Christian, right? Invocations to Jesus, to Mary, to God, with invocations to traditional Egyptian gods. So, for example, one of my personal favorites is a piece of papyrus that invokes the god Hor or Horus, as well as Jesus, to keep scorpions out of the house. Um, and this is just part and parcel of how local religious traditions seem to be functioning at this time. That we have a real, again, melting pot of traditions that we want to distinguish between pagan and Christian, but the local individuals who are employing these traditions seem to see them both as valid and use them in tandem with one another.
Hmm. I find it fascinating that, for lack of a better word, I find it fascinating how quote unquote pagan traditions persisted that far along. I would have imagined that a lot of it would have been forcefully stamped out by the seventh century or by the eighth century, and yet they persisted. Now, was magic, was it always malignant? Was the magic always binding, cursing, or were there other more benign magical incantations?
There were certainly benign magical traditions that are alive and well in antiquity. We have amulets against all sorts of things where people are trying to solve their health problems. We have to. One of the critical things I think we don't always give enough credit to is the progress that has been made in the past 150, 200 years in our understanding of the body and how we fix medical problems. And in antiquity, when they don't have germ theory and they
Mhm.
don't really understand very much at all about the inner workings of the body, magic is a great solution for this. So there are many instances, I think, in antiquity, in Cyprus and elsewhere in the Mediterranean, where we can see people using spells to help themselves. Right? You may have a spell to uh, help you win favor, right? Or to be popular, right? To be successful in your business ventures, or to fix an ailment. Your knee hurts when you work outside too much. So there's an amulet to help
Yeah,
you do that. So I think that all these things are very common, very
yeah.
commonplace.
And then I think you even touch upon love spells that came out of Egypt, and you suggest that there may have been a very real Cypriot connection to some of these love spells that were discovered, excavated in Egypt, that perhaps even suggests a Cypriot template.
That perhaps could be the case. What we know in antiquity, or what we think we know, I should always say.
Yeah,
These things are always under discussion and revision, of
yeah,
course. But we think that at times spells would have, like, spell bits, little fragments of spells, would have circulated throughout the Mediterranean, and would have been picked up to be used in multiple contexts. So the spell in particular that you're referring to is from one of the curse tablets,
mhm,
from Amathus. It's one of the tablets that was written on selenite, which is a translucent crystallized form of gypsum.
mhm,
And on this spell, we have an invocation to various chthonic or underworld deities. And the goal of the spell is to silence an opponent, presumably in a law case. Well, this same spell pops up, or the same invocation, right? The same speech, the same text, pops up in a spell in a manual that is a recipe book for magic in Egypt. And in this new context, it's being used as a love spell. So
mhm.
it's a fascinating transmission of magical knowledge. It becomes a question about whether we can sort of draw a direct line between Amathus and this spell from Egypt or not. It is possible, and this is one thing that I think we have to consider as a possibility, that perhaps this spell text uh, came into Egypt, and because it came from Cyprus, and because Cyprus is so closely associated with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, it seemed appropriate that this spell text, this invocation, should be used for love magic, and that's where I think we can say probably people perhaps understood where ritual traditions were coming from, and when they went to incorporate them into new spells, they might kind of reference that, so that those spells become important to love, because Cyprus is associated with love magic.
I find it a very appealing explanation. Knowing what we know about Cyprus being the birthplace of Aphrodite, as you said. That when I came across that, I said, "Oh, that seems about right." You also say so. Let's circle back to something you mentioned, and we're going to kind of dive into the Amathusian Curse Tablets again. A lot of these curses emerge in times of crisis, and you mentioned at the start there was one that was targeted towards Theodorus, and who was the hegemon, for lack of a better word, of Cyprus at the time.
Mhm.
And he was cursed by a man named Alexandros. What were these times of crisis? I mean, and you don't necessarily have to just speak about Cyprus. If you can, and if you can recall about the different curse tablets, and I know not all have been published, but what's the common theme in these curse tablets? What are the issues that arise in second and third century Cyprus that necessitates them to create these curse tablets?
I think that's a great question, Andreas. And again, we're at a place I think where we wish the tablets told us a little bit more
Mhm.
about people's lives. So often, the tablets are really the result of a personal crisis. Someone has a conflict with a neighbor. Someone we know that one of the tablets there's a reference to cloth. Another tablet has a reference to livestock, we think. Nowadays, we might think these are pretty small time crises,
Mhm.
but presumably for the individuals that suffered these things, they were major problems, right? We can think in our own lives if if someone loses their job, if someone has a theft of from their house, those aren't small things for the individual, and I think many of the curse tablets are reflecting personal crises. At the same time, in the third century CE, as in much of the Roman Empire, there were economic crises going on. There was a lot of economic problems that people would have suffered on Cyprus as elsewhere. So perhaps some of these tablets are kind of the result of economic troubles that people are feeling in their lives.
Can we say that these curses give them a sort of legal leverage over their intended targets?
Oh, what a wonderful question that is. Again, we can only make assessments from the tablets themselves and sort of make guesses at why people are doing these things. Most of the tablets seem to be related to court cases, as you mentioned. And the real question is, why are people writing these tablets? What are they getting out of it? On the one hand, it seems, as my colleague Esther Eidnow has suggested, that a lot of individuals are trying to manage risk in their lives. They know they're in a court battle with someone. They think that they're right. They are worried, though, as anyone would be in a legal situation, and they want to find the best ways to both succeed and to feel confident going into the trial. So a curse occupies that space, right? They can write a curse against their opponent, and ideally, they will believe that they're going to do better in the trial. Now, the question you have to ask is, what's the real effect of this? Like, what this is, does this have any impact on people's lives or not? Certainly, I think we can say they may feel more confident going into that trial. They may feel like they've got it in the bag now because they've cursed their opponent. On the other hand, the practitioner who's responsible for writing out the curse for them now has a degree of knowledge that may be used in the community through channels like gossip and other clandestine means, right? To kind of let the victim know that they've been cursed. So we also have kind of psychological games, if you will, on the other side, where individuals may hear that they've been cursed, and their performance in a case may suffer.
Right.
Uh, so, why they're doing it, and getting back to your question, I think they're doing it largely because they want to kind of provide themselves with a bit of an insurance policy to up their own side in their legal conflict. Um, what the real effect is, it's a little bit harder to say, but I think we can talk about kind of a feeling of confidence on the one hand, and possibly in the community a situation where the opponent is going to not do quite as well, perhaps. Again, psychologically speaking.
Yeah, there's this. I was a fan years ago. HBO put out this show called Rome. Only lasted lamentably for 2 seasons, but in those 2 seasons, we see the rise of Caesar and eventually his fall. But there's an episode in the second season where a character named Servilia, she's cursing. Julius Caesar. And I encourage anyone just to look this up. Just look up Rome HBO curse scene. It's very appealing just to watch. And you can see her in this scene. She's furiously scribbling on a lead scroll, invoking the Furies, invoking Nemesis, Tyche, and she's alone. She has this what presumably looks like a lead tablet and some sort of stylus, and she's making these markings as she's reciting this curse. And we got to step back. I feel like because there's so many things that are involved in making a curse tablet. If I'm not mistaken, you got the composition of the text, manufacturing of the tablet, its inscription, even its deposition. So how accurate would you call that scene? And if you don't know the scene that I'm referring to, just how private, or in Cyprus's case, how public would manufacturing of a Chris tablet have to be?
Well, Andreas, I know the scene very, very well, largely because I show it in my class every time I teach. I teach a
I
course
figured as
at
much, eh?
Wilburn, called Magic and Mystery Cults in the Ancient World. And when we talk about Roman cursing, I show that scene. So I'm very well familiar with it. I think it's a great scene. It has some problems, of course. There are a couple of allowances that we have to make. It is relatively accurate. In the scene, Servilia is shown inscribing the curse. Um, I think we do know during this time period that there were professionals who may have been more common as people to inscribe a curse. But we have plenty of instances, particularly at the site of Bath in England, where we know individuals were inscribing their own curse tablets. Um, she is shown in the scene, as you said, inscribing it on lead with a stylus. That's not inaccurate. She's got some drawings on the tablet.
Mhm.
Again, not inaccurate, but drawings come a little bit later, more often. Um, uh, what they get right in the scene is I think they show her rolling the tablet up, which is pretty common, and invoking a spell as she writes the tablet. So when we look at that scene, we have to always remember that a ritual, right, consists of an act that a person does while they're manipulating an object. And the scene, I think, does a very good job of showing us that juxtaposition between her invocation to divinities, um, uh, some of whom we know from actual curse tablets, and the fact that she's inscribing it at the same time and manipulating using gesture to kind of enact her curse on this piece of lead, almost right, to transfer what she's imagining will happen to Caesar to this tablet. And then, as you rightly note, at the close of the scene, she has another individual take the tablet and stick it in between the bricks of a building. And here, too, we're on pretty good ground, archaeologically speaking, because we know that tablets were deposited in a variety of places, many of which were conduits to the underworld, right? Places where people believe the spirits of the dead could be reached, such as graves. But other tablets are sometimes deposited in places where they were believed to have an effect. All right, so you put it where you want it to work. So in this case, we get tablets sometimes placed in people's houses, um, or we have literary references to that, or uh, in chariot races, sometimes like at the starting gates. Romans loved chariot racing, and they also loved cursing horses and charioteers
Mm.
in the third and fourth centuries. So a lot of times we get the curse tablets actually put in the circus, in the arenas for chariot racing. So a lot of it I think is good, and like I said, show it in my class all the time. I think it's a
Yeah,
great scene.
but in Cyprus though, this wouldn't have been necessarily a private practice. They would have approached someone. Like if we think about Pliny's reference to that class of practitioners, paint a picture for me, like humor me a little bit here. Is this someone who has a shop that's open, and they're selling these blank templates, and hey, this come get your curses done up here. Like how does that kind of work out?
That's a really great question. We don't know precisely how public or how out in the open a practitioner of magic would have been. There's a lot of questions in some ways wrapped up in what you're asking, Andreas. And if I can roll us back a little bit and talk some about what we do know from the tablets themselves, I think that'll get us started. So the tablets from Amathus definitely were produced by professionals. We know this because of the published examples. Almost all of them use the same spell text, right? So someone had a magical spell book, and they were copying the text for the curse out of that spell book onto a lead tablet. We also know from the tablets, both the lead ones and the ones written on selenite, that translucent form of gypsum, that the tablets were being written by multiple individuals. So we don't have just a single individual who's like lurking at the edge of the village, right?
Yeah,
Doing this.
yeah.
But we have multiple people who are active. Now, maybe they're active over successively, or maybe they're active at the same time.
Well, how
Hard
do
to
we how
say.
do we know how do we know this?
Handwriting.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow,
we
yeah.
can identify the handwriting. It's clear. I mean, we have different hands. We think, right? I mean, these are all, um, assessment, right? But we have different hands apparent on lead tablets and on the selenite ones. We don't know if the same people are writing the selenite and the lead because the materials are so different. But you can sort of look at the way that people draw or write out different letter forms, and know that different people are writing them. So we have good examples from Amathus that multiple people are at work. They're using at least, I think I think we know of at least three different, maybe four different set texts. That is like model texts in their recipe book. Um, to write these spells, and they're as we've talked about, they're producing a lot of these things. We have
Mhm.
upwards of 230 examples from Cyprus, so it's a big business there. The question of where, how, precisely what their social status is a little bit harder to untangle. Um, some of my more recent work has been on looking at kind of what's the connection that we see between magical production, right? That is, the production of these curse tablets and temples and sort of traditional ritual spaces. The answer there is, again, not completely clear. I feel like that's what I keep saying over and over again. But we have some evidence from other sites in the Mediterranean, not from Amathus, regrettably, where there's the production of these curses is associated with temples, perhaps with priests in the temples, or perhaps with people who are hanging around the temples, kind of selling their specializations. So, to answer your question, if I can circle back to it, I think we know that we have professionals. We know that people would have
Yeah.
known about the professionals. They would have gone to them to help them solve the problems of their lives.
By defining what these suspension holes were, I think we'll have a better understanding of what these binding spells were exactly, because some of these tablets, they had suspension holds. In other words, they were meant to be displayed, which was crazy. So where were they? Where were they displayed? To whom were they being displayed to?
Yep, absolutely. So we know it's a complicated archaeological context, because it was not found in the modern period, and it was found in 1890,
Mhm.
and it wasn't found by archaeologists excavating the site. Rather, what happened is in sometime before 1891, a group of local individuals, probably near Agios Tikonos, ancient Amathus, um, were digging a shaft, probably for a well, and they found this shaft, and in it were these tablets. They were under a collection of bones, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the tablets, according to the people who were reporting this, they found the tablets, that the selenite tablets, right, the stone ones, were in the walls of the shaft, and the lead ones sometimes were attached. They were rolled up, but then attached to the walls of the shaft with nails. And the one of the early, people who publish it describes it as if it's bristling with curses on the way down to Hades. Right? It's a bit of a paraphrase,
Yeah.
but so we know that probably whoever was making these spells descended the shaft and put them in place. Um, who are they for? It's a great question. We're probably 30, 40 feet underground, according to the local testimony. So most residents of Amathus are not going to be visiting this location.
So I go Saturday night.
Right, exactly. What I love to do is climb down a 40-foot shaft and look at what's there. So for the most part, it seems these are made for underworld divinities who they're addressing, and for the dead, who are also likely to encounter them. So when we talk about display, we have to remember too. We make a nice, tidy distinction between the dead and the living in our world, but in antiquity, that division was a little bit more permeable, and the dead could be really a part of people's lives in a way that we have trouble, perhaps, some of us at least, have trouble really conceptualizing today.
The quote that I read at the start of this recording, it says, "I invoke you, demons, many men buried together, and dead by violence, and dead before your time, and deprived of burial." Are we to infer then that this is possibly based on the wording of this particular curse tablet, that it was deposited in a mass burial of soldiers, plague, what have you, who are unknown and forgotten, and we know the importance of burial rites in ancient Greece and Rome. Is there a particular appeal to soliciting those dead, even though we didn't find them, we didn't exactly, like you said, we didn't exactly find them recently, found them in the late 19th century. But is that what we can infer?
That's a really great question, because that we run into a problem in this instance, because the reported archaeological context suggests that the bones. So let me backtrack. The reported archaeological context tells us that when the local Cypriot individuals were in the process of discovering these tablets, they found, going in order from the top down, right? They found some cut stones, rubble, and then a mass of human bones, some of which had earrings, and then below that were the tablets. The problem archaeologically is that necessarily the bones had to be deposited after the tablets, right? Because because it would have been impossible for the individuals, the practitioners, to basically crawl through the bones, right, to get to the tablets to mount them on the walls. So we have it seems to me in my reading that the practitioners used this shaft, and then some later event caused this group of dead individuals, perhaps a plague or war, to be buried in this place. What the tablets are telling us, though, is that they are invoking spirits of the dead who the ancients thought of as restless. And these dead individuals, these are ghosts that for various reasons could not find peace in the afterlife. The restless dead were those who were unburied, That's a very important category of restless dead. They hadn't received proper burial rites, so they were angry about that. They weren't honored as dead individuals. Other restless dead included young men or women who died before their time, particularly men or women who were not able to marry and who were not able to have children, which was believed to be one of the goals of life. So the tablets are explicit in invoking classes of restless dead who would have been angry and who would have been hanging around. Uh, Again, it's very complicated because the archaeological evidence doesn't necessarily indicate that these tablets are being buried in a mass grave, but rather that they're just invoking the dead. The mass grave happened later. I
Okay.
wish it were different.
Yeah. Yeah.
It would be
I
so
wasn't expecting that. I really wasn't expecting that.
it would be so much easier if the archaeological evidence didn't contradict the texts.
Yeah.
But unluckily it does. It doesn't match as
Okay.
close.
So, with that being said, there's still an appeal to the dead, whether one came before the other. This type of magic, we call it binding spells. So, what exactly can you expect to get out of a binding spell, and why are binding spells so associated with the dead?
That's a great question. So binding spells, as we understand them, are spells intended to incapacitate or otherwise prevent a victim from doing something. Most typically in antiquity, what we run into are lead tablets that have been inscribed with the names of individuals. So I think I mentioned earlier in our conversation, we these binding spells first appear on the island of Sicily and in Athens, and they're often just the names of individuals written on a lead tablet and then rolled up and deposited somewhere. As time goes by, or even in some early instances, the tablets make reference to underworld divinities or to the dead, asking for their help to bind or prevent a victim from doing something. By the time we get to the third century, when the Amathus tablets are being deposited, um, the spells that are intended to bind an individual are intensely complicated and wildly robust, if you will. Um, the spells are calling upon a variety of divinities, traditional Greek and Roman gods that are associated with the underworld, as well as divinities from other cultures, Osiris, Re from Egypt. They also have lots of what we refer to as magical words interspersed in the text. Um, Nowadays our most common magical word is abracadabra, which is of ancient origin, actually dates from the second century CE. But they have all these magical words which we don't understand. They just sound like gobbledygook or gibberish to us.
Yeah.
But they were believed to either act as names for divinities, like secret names, or were viewed as words of power that would cause a magical act to come to fruition. Um, so, binding spells are being used, like I said, to typically to prevent someone from taking an action. Later on, we do get certain spells that are intended to punish or hurt an individual, but the goal is often to prevent them from doing something. At the same time, we have a tradition that seems to be related of ritual figurines. That is, small poppets or dolls. You mentioned those earlier. We don't have these on Cyprus, but we have them from elsewhere. And they are figurines sometimes made of clay, sometimes made of lead, where an individual is shown often with their hands bound behind their back, sometimes on their knees. So they're often little figurines. They're roughly humanoid in shape. And the appearance, again, is to suggest that the victim of the spell um, is is like a captive. They're like a prisoner, and again, they're not supposed to be able to do something that would harm or otherwise would be a problem for the commissioner of the spell. What's interesting about the ritual figurines is that we have an early reference in Plato, the philosopher, that people, according to Plato, people see these little figurines at various places, and it makes them afraid, right? So we know that in classical Greece, at least, um, this tradition is going on, that people are using these figurines for the same purpose, to bind an enemy or to bind a person that they're having a conflict with, and prevent them from doing something.
Why Amathus? Why do we have 200, 230, you said, of these types of tablets? Do we have any idea as to its significance, or is it just one of many city kingdoms that, well, they weren't when these were found. It wasn't a city kingdom at that time, but is it inevitable that we'll probably find a lot more of these elsewhere on Cyprus, or was there something in particular about that city?
I hope we find more. They're fascinating objects, and as I said before, they give us this insight into individuals' lives that
Yeah.
so hard to get. But I don't know that Amathus is special. I think it's a happenstance of discovery.
Hmm.
Um, we have curses, so we have 200 from Amathus, more than 200. Um, the the use of selenite, the use of this stone, is quite unusual. That appears to be a local tradition that's different from elsewhere, because we don't have curses written on that stone in other locations. But we do have, and we don't have the number that we have at Amathus anywhere else. We have other caches of curses. We have quite a few from Caesarea that are in the process of being published. I think close to 80. We have something like 50 found at a burial space in Rome. We have 12 or so from a well in the Athenian Agora. We have quite a few from North Africa. Um, so there are places where we have sort of groups of tablets that all seem to be created by local individuals who are kind of what I think of as collectives of individuals, perhaps, who are working to supply these to the local community. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily unusual or distinctive. It just happens to be that we have a lot of them from Cyprus.
Hmm. We know that in ancient Cyprus and a lot of these temples, a lot of ex votos were deposited in order to thank a god for healing, right? And let's say, and often they were produced in clay replicas, maybe a foot,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a hand. I know you're familiar with all these. What you may not be familiar with is that this is a tradition that, to a certain degree, still exists within the Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm.
In many Orthodox churches, you can see representations of feet, or hands or eyes strung up near icons in the church, which was brought at some point by someone who had prayed to that particular saint or to the church and has been healed, and they brought a representation of that ailment to the church in order to thank the saint. So stuff like that. I always find continuity incredibly fascinating. We're the same people fundamentally from 2,000 years ago, and anytime I get to see the clear evidence of continuity, I'm just like I'm struck by it. I'm like, when I explain this to my wife, I tell her that it's not like, for me, when I like going to these ancient sites, it's not the stone that I find amazing. It's more of who was here, who walked this
Mm-hmm.
path that I'm on. Who sat down in this home and from a hard day at work and drank a nice cool cup of water, and what did they talk about? That's what I find so amazing. That's what I find so interesting about history. And so when I see continuity, like I am naturally drawn to it.
No, I share those same joys, if you will, of visiting places. To think both about what people experienced, what their life stories were that
Mhm.
are lost to us, but there were people, right? They had dreams, they had desires,
Yeah.
and seeing how not that they're necessarily a line of continuity,
Mhm.
but that in many ways they're certainly tapping into the same fears, same concerns that people had in antiquity. That people change, of course, but they don't change that much, right? We many of the same anxieties and concerns about health, well-being, about our families, right? About belief that somebody's out to get me because I did something, maybe because I didn't, and all these are just beliefs that we share. What I tell my students, one of the things I really enjoy about studying antiquity is the fact that it is far enough away from us, and so foreign that oftentimes it allows us to look at our own society in a different way, right? Because you imagine how would they think that was right, but you also can see yourself in the person who's sitting having a glass of water, right?
Yeah.
So it serves both roles. It's a moment where you connect, where you can see the continuity, and you can also note the discontinuity with your own world, and it helps you think about both aspects in a real and meaningful way.
Online, I noticed that you're currently studying how magic plays in architecture, and you're investigating the placement of protective features in houses and other buildings. Never did I ever consider that. Can you, before we sign off, can you just tell me about your research now?
Absolutely, absolutely. My research now is really interested in. Um, it's really grounded, I would say, in the family, as it were, because the house is essentially the domestic space, right? The architectural space that encloses the family for the most part, for the ancients, right? That's where children are born, children are reared. That's where you retreat to after the troubles of the day. But that space was also a space where danger could enter. um, there are innumerable threats that would have faced an ancient individual, from sickness to ghosts, which we've already been talking about, to intruders, to any variety of things that could harm your family, and of course, uh, many of the things that would happen to a family were unexplained in antiquity. Right? Why, for example, might a child die without an apparent cause, or why would a woman die in childbirth? Um, Many of those things, which we understand medically now, were blamed on external threats. And my interest in this project has been both to kind of identify what people thought those threats were, while also trying to see how they use the architecture of the home to protect and enclose the family, to block out intruders, whether they be real human beings or vermin, such as scorpions or snakes, or more ethereal, such as ghosts or demonic spirits, all of which could enter a home through doors and windows, right? So that's sort of where that project is now, looking at, as I said, both the range of threats that people felt needed to be protected against, and the magical means that people would use to protect against those threats. And those included all sorts of things: inscriptions that may have been placed on door frames, um, mosaic floors that would have been used in the house or at the entryway, um, things that would have been placed on the lintels or the frames of the doors. Many various means that people could use to protect their home, protect their family.
So, where have you been investigating? Is this primarily, say, in the Italian Peninsula? Is this across the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, Levantine?
It's
Where exactly?
pretty much across the Mediterranean. It's a lot of the work has been Pompeii, of course, has
Yeah,
good preservation, so it gives me a lot of good stuff to look at. But I've also been looking in Egypt, some in Spain. There's a lot of material from again the Levant. I've got to find some sites on Cyprus to return to go and work there. It's such a great place to be. So I'm hoping I can find some locations there that'll provide me with some new evidence to work on.
absolutely. Any excuse, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's why I became an archaeologist. Not
Yeah,
just the love of the material, but also the love of the people and places I get to visit and interact with.
I'm incredibly grateful
This is fun.
for the recording.
Yeah,
So, again, thank you so much, Drew. Really appreciated everything, and I appreciate your time. And I hope you have a great rest of the week.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Okay,
take care.
talk to you later.